He thought he was just slapping a random Latino man, but when the truth came out, he was forced to kneel before his own boss. The morning sun poured over the quiet streets of a suburban American neighborhood. The sidewalks were lined with neat hedges and carefully trimmed lawns, but there was an air of tension that few could notice. On one corner stood Alejandro Ramirez, a Latino man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another working man starting his day. But beneath his calm demeanor was a man of immense authority, though that secret was not something most people knew at first glance. Alejandro carried a briefcase in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. He had purposely left his official car behind that morning, preferring to walk a few blocks to clear his head before the grueling day ahead. His position demanded immense responsibility, and today was not going to be easy. What he didn't expect was that, before stepping into his office, his morning would spiral into chaos. Just as he reached the corner store to buy a bottle of water, two police cruisers pulled up aggressively, tires screeching. Their sirens were off, but the flashing lights pierced the calm morning air. From the vehicles emerged two uniformed police officers, their faces tight with self-importance. They didn't hesitate. Within seconds, they approached Alejandro. "Hey, you!" One of them barked, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon. "What are you doing hanging around here?" Alejandro blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? I'm just getting some water. Is there a problem?" The second officer, younger but more aggressive, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed, his tone sharp. "Don't play smart with us. We've had complaints of suspicious individuals in this area. You fit the description." Alejandro let out a small sigh. He had heard this tone before, the voice of prejudice, of authority unchecked. Calmly, he placed his coffee down on the hood of the police cruiser. "Officers, I assure you I'm no threat. I live just a few blocks away, if you'll allow me." But before he could finish, the younger officer shoved him against the hood of the car. The slam echoed down the street, causing a few onlookers to pause in shock. Alejandro clenched his jaw, but he remained composed. "Don't resist," the officer growled. Alejandro turned his head slightly, his voice low and measured. "I am not resisting. You're making a mistake." The senior officer smirked, stepping closer. "Mistake, huh? You people are always full of excuses." And then it happened. In a moment of reckless arrogance, the younger cop slapped Alejandro hard, across the face. The crack of the impact silenced the murmurs of the bystanders. The slap was filled with disrespect, meant not just to control but to humiliate. Alejandro's head turned with the force, his lip bleeding slightly. He straightened, his eyes darkening, but he didn't retaliate. Instead, he simply looked at the officer, calm but piercing. "You don't know who you're talking to," Alejandro said slowly. The officer sneered. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to. Another punk who thinks he can outsmart the law." Little did they know, the punk they had just slapped was none other than Deputy Chief of Police Alejandro Ramirez, their direct superior, the man who signed off on their promotions, transfers, and even disciplinary actions. The bystanders whispered louder now, some recording on their phones. One elderly woman shook her head. "Those officers just messed up big time," she murmured. Alejandro took a breath, still choosing restraint. His hand brushed the lapel of his hoodie, where inside his concealed badge rested. The slap still stung, but what was about to come would sting much more for the officers. The street had grown unnervingly quiet. The slap still echoed in Alejandro's ears, but his silence unsettled the officers more than any words could. He didn't yell, didn't fight back, didn't even raise his voice. That composure, that piercing calm in his eyes, made the older officer shift uneasily. "Search him," the younger one barked, still trying to sound dominant. The senior officer hesitated, but followed orders. He patted Alejandro down, running, his hands across his sides. That's when his palm hit something inside the jacket pocket. Smooth, solid, metallic. A badge. Pulling it out with careless arrogance, the officer expected a fake ID, something he could mock. Instead, his eyes widened. It wasn't some plastic shield bought off the internet. It was the official crest of the city's police department. Not just a standard officer's badge either. The number, the design, the weight. It screamed authority. "Wait, this can't be right," the older cop stammered, stepping back. The younger officer frowned, snatching it from him. "What are you talking about? It's probably—" His voice faltered mid-sentence. His eyes darted from the badge to Alejandro's face, back to the badge again. The title engraved at the bottom sent an icy chill down his spine. Deputy Chief of Police. The color drained from his face. His jaw went slack. For the first time that morning, his arrogant confidence crumbled. Alejandro slowly turned, his lip still bleeding from the slap. He looked directly at both men, his gaze sharp, commanding. "Do you know what that badge means?" he asked quietly. "Neither," officer answered. The younger one tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. The older officer took a step back, his hand trembling slightly as he realized the gravity of their actions. Alejandro continued, his tone cutting like steel. "That badge means you just laid your hands on your boss." The words struck like a thunderclap. The crowd of onlookers gasped, whispers spreading like wildfire. Phones recorded every angle, every expression. The same officer who had so proudly slapped him now looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under his feet. Alejandro leaned closer, his voice low enough for only them to hear. But the tone carried enough weight to pierce their souls. "You disrespected the uniform. You disrespected the badge. And you disrespected me." The older officer's knees nearly buckled. He quickly lowered his head in shame. "Sir, we didn't know—" "Didn't know?" Alejandro snapped, his voice suddenly booming with authority. "You didn't care to know. You saw my skin, my clothes, and you made your judgment. That is not policing. That is disgrace." The younger officer's bravado evaporated. His hands shook as he fumbled for words. "Sir, please, it was a misunderstanding." Alejandro cut him off. "A misunderstanding does not leave bruises on a man's face. A misunderstanding does not slap the deputy chief of police in front of civilians." He paused, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't a mistake. It was arrogance. And arrogance has consequences. The crowd was eating it up, murmuring louder. A man in the back shouted, "Yeah, hold them accountable." Someone else cheered, "That's karma right there." The younger cop's chest rose and fell rapidly. His pride battled with fear, but fear was winning fast. Finally, in a desperate display of regret, he did something that stunned the crowd even more. He dropped to one knee. I didn't know, sir," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Please forgive me." The sight was surreal. The same officer who had struck Alejandro moments earlier was now kneeling in front of him like a soldier to his general. The older officer followed suit reluctantly, his face red with shame as he lowered himself to his knees too. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. Phones clicked, videos rolled. This was more than an apology. This was a public reckoning. Alejandro looked down at them, his jaw clenched, his silence speaking volumes. The man who had been treated as a suspect minutes ago was now being shown the respect he had earned his entire career. But Alejandro knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the culture that allowed men like these to abuse power, until reality forced them to kneel. He let the silence linger before finally speaking. "Get up," he commanded. Both men scrambled to their feet, their eyes downcast. Alejandro straightened his jacket, wiped the blood from his lip, and picked up his badge from the cruiser's hood. Holding it up for the crowd to see, his voice boomed again. "Remember this moment. Not for me, but for every person out there who's been treated as less because of how they look, where they're from, or what someone assumed about them. Justice starts when arrogance ends." The bystanders erupted into applause and cheers. The officers stood frozen, ashamed, knowing their careers were hanging by a thread. Alejandro turned, his expression hard as stone. "Now, gentlemen," he said, locking eyes with the younger officer in particular, "we're going to have a very serious conversation back at headquarters." The drive back to headquarters was heavy with silence. The younger officer, Officer Daniels, sat in the passenger seat of the cruiser with his fists clenched tight against his knees. His confidence had bled out the moment he realized who Alejandro was. The older officer, Sergeant Miller, drove stiffly, his eyes fixed on the road, every muscle tense as though one wrong twitch would seal his fate. In the back seat, Alejandro sat with his badge resting on his lap. He hadn't said much since commanding them into the vehicle, and that silence was far more terrifying than any shouting could have been. The power dynamics had reversed completely. Moments ago, the officers thought they held control over a random suspect. Now they were transporting their own deputy chief of police, the very man who could end their careers with a single stroke of his pen. When the cruiser pulled into the underground parking lot of headquarters, word had already spread. Officers outside straightened instantly upon spotting Alejandro step out, some saluting him respectfully. Daniels and Miller followed behind, their faces pale, feeling the sting of humiliation as their peers watched. The whispers cut through, them like knives. Is that Daniels? He looks like he's walking to his funeral. What did they do? Alejandro walked with measured steps, not once looking back at the two men. He led them straight into the internal affairs wing of the building, a place both officers had only entered to testify against others, never to stand accused themselves. Inside the small, sterile room, Alejandro finally turned to face them. He placed his badge on the table, the metallic sound sharp in the silence. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Sit," he ordered. The two officers obeyed instantly. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his knee bouncing nervously. Miller sat stiffly, his eyes locked on the floor. Alejandro folded his hands on the table, his voice calm but weighted. "Do you know why you're here?" Daniels cleared his throat, his voice trembling. Because of what happened earlier, sir. But we didn't know." Alejandro's eyes narrowed. "Stop right there. That's your first mistake. You think the issue is that you didn't know who I was. But let me make this clear. It wouldn't matter if I was the deputy chief, a janitor, or just a man getting water from the store. The way you treated me was unacceptable, period." Miller finally spoke, his tone low and ashamed. "Sir, you're right. We acted out of line. I should have stopped it, but I didn't." Alejandro leaned forward, his voice cold. "You both abused your power. You profiled me. You escalated a harmless situation. And then Daniels." He paused, his eyes locking on the younger officer. "You struck me, not because I posed a threat, but because you wanted to assert dominance. That slap wasn't about control. It was about humiliation." Daniels opened his mouth to defend himself, but quickly shut it again. His lip quivered, but no words came. Alejandro's tone sharpened. "You carry a badge. That badge is a promise. To protect, to serve, and to uphold the law, not to become the very threat the public fears." The silence in the room was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in on the two officers, their own shame crushing them. Finally, Alejandro stood, his tall frame towering over them. He paced slowly, his footsteps echoing in the sterile room. "I should fire you both today. Strip you of your uniforms, your weapons, your dignity. But I believe in justice, not vengeance." He stopped and turned sharply. "So here's what's going to happen." Both officers sat up, bracing themselves. "You will face an internal investigation," Alejandro said firmly. "Your actions were recorded by civilians, and that footage will become evidence. Until then, you are suspended, effective immediately." Daniel's face went pale. "Suspended?" "Sir, please." Alejandro raised his hand. "Don't. You brought this on yourself. If you're lucky, you'll still have a badge by the time this is over. But mark my words. If it were up to me alone, neither of you would ever wear a uniform again." Miller closed his eyes, his head hanging in shame. Daniel's breathing quickened, his pride and career crumbling right before him. Alejandro leaned closer, his voice low but deadly serious. "I've spent my life fighting to change this department, to make sure the people trust us. And then I see men like you undoing everything with one arrogant action. You didn't just disrespect me, you disrespected the entire force." The words landed like hammers, crushing what little pride the two officers had left. Alejandro straightened, his decision final. "You'll leave your weapons and badges here today. You'll wait for the review board. Until then, you are no longer officers of this department." The room went silent again. Daniels looked like he wanted to cry. Miller looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. Alejandro picked up his own badge, sliding it back into his pocket. "Dismissed," he said coldly. Security entered the room to escort the disgraced officers out. As they walked down the hallway, the stares of their peers burned holes in their backs. The same men who once walked with swagger now looked like broken shells of themselves. And Alejandro? He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He only thought of the bigger picture, the community watching, the trust at stake, and the lessons that needed to be learned. This wasn't just about two officers. This was about the soul of the department. The next morning, Alejandro awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Dozens of missed calls, texts, and notifications flooded the screen. For a man in his position, this was nothing unusual, but the sheer volume made him frown. When he opened his news app, the reason became clear. Front and center, the headline blared. Deputy chief slapped by his own officers. Karma caught on camera. Alejandro set the phone down, exhaling slowly. He had expected fallout, but not this fast, not this loud. The video of the encounter outside the corner store had gone viral overnight. Millions of views, thousands of comments, hashtags trending across platforms. Justice for Ramirez, police karma, and profiling clips showed the moment Officer Daniels slapped him, the crowd gasping, the reveal of the badge, and finally, the sight of both officers kneeling in shame. The internet devoured it, dissecting every frame, every expression. Talk shows debated it. Some anchors called it a wake-up call for policing culture. Others criticized the officers' arrogance. Civil rights activists shared the clip as proof of systemic issues. And ordinary people, especially those from Latino and minority communities, saw it as a victory, a moment of poetic justice. At the station, things weren't quiet either. The suspension of Daniels and Miller had sent shockwaves through the ranks. Officers whispered in hallways, some defending their colleagues, others condemning them outright. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on everyone. Morale was shaky, trust even shakier. By midday, Alejandro found himself standing behind a podium at a press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the table, reporters leaned forward eagerly. He wore his crisp uniform now, the shining badge on his chest reflecting the bright lights. He adjusted the microphone, his face calm, his voice steady. "Yesterday morning," he began, "an incident occurred involving myself and two officers of this department. That video has now circulated widely. I want to address it directly." The room fell silent. Alejandro continued, his tone unwavering. "What happened to me was wrong. But more importantly, it wasn't about me. It was about what happens to countless men and women across this country, people stopped, profiled, or mistreated because of assumptions. I was fortunate enough to have a badge to reveal. Many others do not." Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking nonstop. "This department," Alejandro went on, "must stand for integrity. We are here to serve, not to intimidate. We are here to protect, not to abuse. And when we fail to live up to those standards, accountability must follow. That's why the two officers involved have been suspended pending investigation. And let me be clear, this department will not tolerate behavior that disrespects the uniform or the people we serve." The applause that followed wasn't common at press conferences. But this wasn't a common moment. Alejandro had struck a chord, not just with his city, but with the nation. That evening, cable news replayed his speech on a loop. Commentators praised his candor. Community leaders called it a turning point. Parents showed their children the clip as an example of dignity in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, Daniels and Miller sat in silence at their homes, watching the world unravel around them. Their names trended online, their faces plastered across television screens. Neighbors avoided them. Friends stopped calling. Their arrogance from just 24 hours ago had turned into humiliation on a national scale. Daniels slammed his fist on the coffee table, his voice breaking. "My career's over. I'm done." Miller, older and more reflective, just shook his head. "We did this to ourselves. No one else to blame." Back at his own home, Alejandro sat quietly in his study. The weight of it all pressed on him. The attention, the responsibility, the expectations. He hadn't asked to be a symbol, but now the world saw him as one. He thought of the countless cases he'd seen in his career, the voices silenced because no one recorded, no one believed. Now, fate had chosen his humiliation to spark a conversation. His wife entered the room, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Alejandro nodded slowly. "The right thing for today, yes. But the real question is, what happens tomorrow?" Outside, protests had begun. Not against him, but against the culture that allowed men like Daniels and Miller to act without hesitation. People marched with signs, accountability, not arrogance. Serve and protect, not slap and humiliate. It was no longer just about one slap, one moment. It was about something far bigger, and Alejandro knew. The real storm hadn't even arrived yet. Weeks passed, but the city was still buzzing. The slap, the kneeling, the press conference. The incident had seared itself into the public's memory. Every evening, local news covered updates on the investigation into Officers Daniels and Miller. Every morning, social media still carried arguments, hashtags, and fiery debates. Inside police headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. Officers walked a little straighter, spoke a little more carefully, and thought twice before acting impulsively on the streets. The incident wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a warning. A reminder that arrogance could destroy a career overnight. The day of the disciplinary hearing arrived. In a large boardroom, the police review board sat behind a long table, their expressions grave. Alejandro, in full uniform, sat as both witness and deputy chief, his presence commanding respect. Daniels and Miller, stripped of their badges and weapons weeks earlier, sat at the opposite end of the room. The evidence was overwhelming. Civilian footage, witness testimonies, the officers' own body cams, which captured their tone, their escalation, their arrogance. There was no spinning it, no justifying it. The chair of the board leaned forward. "After reviewing all evidence, it is the decision of this board that Officer Daniels is hereby terminated from the police force, effective immediately. His actions were reckless, abusive, and unbecoming of this department." Daniels' face went pale. His career, his identity, everything he had built was gone in a single sentence. He lowered his head, unable to look at anyone. The chair turned to Miller. "As for Sergeant Miller, it is the board's decision that he be demoted, suspended, without pay for 6 months and required to undergo mandatory retraining. Your failure to de-escalate and your complicity in this misconduct make you unfit to hold a position of leadership." Miller closed his eyes. It wasn't the end of his career, but it was a permanent scar, one that would follow him forever. The board adjourned. The officers were led out, their heads bowed in defeat. Justice had spoken. Outside, reporters swarmed for comments, microphones shoved in faces, cameras flashing. Alejandro stepped to the podium once again, his posture strong, his voice resolute. "Today," he said, "we held officers accountable for actions that betrayed the values of this department. This was not about one man's dignity. It was about the dignity of the community we serve. Let this serve as a message. The badge is not a shield for arrogance, nor a weapon for abuse. It is a responsibility. And with responsibility comes accountability." The applause was thunderous. Cameras captured his every word, knowing history was unfolding. Later that evening, Alejandro sat in his office alone, the lights dim, the city skyline glowing through the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, tired, scarred, but steadfast. He thought back to the moment of the slap, the sting on his cheek, the silence afterward, the arrogance in Daniel's eyes. And then the moment of recognition, when that arrogance collapsed into fear. He hadn't wanted vengeance, only justice, and justice, he felt, had been served. But the incident had given him something else too. Clarity. A reminder of why he joined the force decades ago. Not for power, not for titles, but for the people who needed someone to fight for them, to protect them from both criminals and the abuses of authority. His wife entered the office quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's over now," she said softly. Alejandro shook his head. No, this is just the beginning, because deep down he knew the slap wasn't just a personal insult. It was a symptom of something bigger, something that required more than suspensions and terminations. It required change, and if he had to stand as the face of that change, then so be it. The city outside buzzed with life, unaware of the silent vow he made to himself in that office, to keep fighting, to keep reforming, to make sure no one else, Latino, Black, immigrant, or otherwise, would have to face what he did that morning on the corner. The slap had been meant to humiliate him. Instead, it had awakened a movement, and in that moment, Deputy Chief Alejandro Ramirez knew his legacy had just begun.